Hi guys, I'm recording this lecture straight out of the content of your Norton Anthology. This covers the first unit, Introduction, so that's pages like 1 through 17, and that covers the years of 1865 through 1914. Just a short disclaimer, you guys have a quiz on this content. This video is just a supplement to the reading, so I might not cover all of the questions in this video. Make sure that as you're taking the quiz, you've read the content in the book. If you're like, I only want to read the book, I'm not going to really give you much information that's not in the book. I will elaborate on content and kind of make it a little bit more manageable if reading sort of like that history style of writing is difficult for you, then the video will be helpful. But I'm not necessarily gonna certainly answer every single quiz question in this video. So make sure before you do take the quiz that you have read the introduction. You have the whole of Unit 1 to take the quiz, and you can go into the quiz and leave the quiz throughout the duration of Unit 1. So if you just want to tackle it a couple questions at a time as you're reading, that's fine too. The way that this lecture will be structured is just section by section from pages 1 through 17. And so the first section that the Norton talks about is this concept of the Gilded Age. And so I just kind of want to clarify what that means and some of the questions that we're going to be thinking about in this unit and some of the questions that our authors are thinking about. As far as time frame goes, we're looking at, again, the specific years are 1865 through 1914, but that's right after the Civil War and right before World War I. And I think that, that time period had a lot of questions of like, what is America? Who are we going to be? And that question, I think while sometimes we like to look back and think that like we're unifying ourselves as a country, that's not necessarily true. What is America and who are we going to be? That question had very different answers depending on what group you're talking about. Men, women, what race you're talking about, Black Americans, Asian Americans, immigrants, white Americans, all of the different groups kind of had these different questions. And so I think that sometimes when we look back at this time period of Reconstruction, we have, I don't know, maybe like movies have given us a false sense of like this unity and this nostalgia of community, but there were a lot of issues that the literature of this time period is working to identify and bring to light and express. And this unit and this lecture and the text that we're going to read are going to kind of try to emphasize and highlight those. So gilded refers to specifically covered thinly with gold leaf or gold paint. You think of like a gilded sword or a gilded picture frame. It's covered with gold leaf. If you've ever watched like DIY, you've probably seen people put gold leaf on I don't know, water bottles or cakes or walls or ceilings or something like that. Gilded can refer to wealthy or privileged. You think about the concept of gold. Gold refers to money, so there's that connection there. But even more so, what's interesting is like that gilded refers to giving a suspicious or false brilliance too. So I think that our historians have coined this time period gilded, rightly so, again, because I think sometimes we look back on it and we're like, what a lovely time, what a wonderful space for America to like form itself and to figure out who they are, but actually maybe that was just surface level loveliness. And some of the things that we're going to talk about in this lecture cover the possibilities of why that was just surface level. And so I think, thinking of gilded in all these different ways is an interesting way to kind of approach this period of American history and of American literature. One of the things that you're going to see, not only just in this part of American Lit 2, in the beginning part of that, but really throughout, is the concept of realism in writing. We're looking at depicting through stories and poems and dramas, we're looking at depicting real life, like what it was really like. And, you know, not necessarily how do we want it to be, but what is it, and what are we going to do if what it is isn't awesome or great or good at all. So some questions about literature that I think authors of the time were trying to answer, or trying to figure out, or maybe trying to find an answer to. How should literature respond to the social problems of its time? So again, should literature highlight those social problems? Should literature offer sort of like this fantasy of what it would look like if we solved these social problems? Should literature offer a fantasy of what it would look like if we didn't solve these social problems? How should literature respond? And there's not obviously one way to answer that. How can language capture what is real? You know, one of the things that we'll talk about kind of toward the end of this lecture is that what is real for some groups of people is not real for other groups of people. We have a lot of marginalized groups, a lot of marginalized voices who don't get to offer what is real. And so a lot of the work that's done in literature in this time period and moving forward is trying to vocalize the people of marginalized groups so that we can see what's real for them, and maybe, you know, if we're not part of that group, understand what their life is like. I think that we can kind of relate to that now. You know, a lot of the social work, and I don't mean social work, but I mean like the work socially that people are doing, is trying to better understand groups of people that you don't belong to, right? You know, you're a culture that you don't understand or know of, or have misunderstood or thought you understood, but maybe you don't. I think there's a lot of overlap between a lot of the things that we're looking at, you know, in the like 2020, 2021, I guess is technically when I'm recording this. So there's a lot of similarities I see as I read through these texts again and through the introduction here, and I think you guys will notice them as well. But how do we capture what is real? How can language do that? Can we do that? There are plenty of questions. You know, can we even really capture what's real? Who gets to decide what counts as realism and what counts as fantasy? How can literature help us to understand the competing perspectives on reality? Again, there are multiple realities, and that just really means, you know, there are multiple perspectives. There are multiple ways that we see things. We might, two people might experience the same event, but their experience of the same event is not the same. And so literature is trying to kind of deal with that and figure that out and understand what that means. And I think it starts in this time period with just offering the different perspectives. That's kind of where we're starting, is here are some different perspectives. Okay, our book also kind of talks about reconstructing America. So right after the Civil War, a lot of people have died, right? We're looking at 620,000 soldier deaths, and our book notes that in terms of civilian deaths, that the authors believe that this is kind of a conservative estimate. So there's likely over 50,000 civilian deaths after the Civil War. You're looking at industrial capitalists coming in, wanting to like make progress on reconstructing America. So you're getting really wealthy people who are funding building things like railroads with their fortunes. So those industrial capitalists are making a lot of money, and blue and white collar workers' wages are rising, but only slightly. So you're going to see there's some sort of like pull in opposite directions between big companies, people with big fortunes, and then kind of like your everyday person. Railroads were built to foster movement and expansion, mostly thinking in movement west rapid urbanization and exponential population growth. I'm talking about not just like cities doubling in size, but cities are quadrupling in size. They're going from, maybe 50,000 people or 500,000 people to millions of people. So a lot of cities are booming. Immigration is happening. Our textbook gives us some pictures from Ellis Island and immigrants coming over to America. A lot of people who maybe had families who came to America, pre-Civil War, have anxiety surrounding immigration, and immigration from multiple countries. And you'll see in the text, especially in the introduction, kind of like the ways in which that anxiety was, I guess, kind of like channeled via immigration. There were a lot of detrimental acts during this time and agreements that favor new government, but at the expense, of course, of Native Americans, where they lost land, they lost culture, while, the book talks about like anthropologists coming in and trying to hold on to some of that lost culture. It's sort of, it's interesting to think about that because it's like the anthropologists are coming in to document something that I'm imagining they're realizing is quickly going to fade away. And so it's maybe this concept of document it before it's gone, which is really sad, because we're watching something fall apart and not really doing that much about it. And there were plenty of detrimental acts that led to this in favor of, industrial capitalists and a lot of expansion. Literature of this time particularly emphasizes also false promises for Black Americans. And so we're going to read a lot of that content as well. The book also covers the literary marketplace. So during this time, things that you maybe are familiar with and now take for granted during this time were just kind of new and being created. Things like book reviews, bestseller lists, and classes of readers. You think about like genres of literature, middle grade novel, young adult lit, like literature for women, maybe literature that's more like science fiction. So not that those are all being created in this time period, that's not what I mean, but more so there are just different classes of readers who are interested in reading different things, and also different educational levels of readers. You've got wealthy, educated people reading certain texts that people with less education but who can read might be reading completely separate texts. And so now we have almost like this division of what people are reading, which can be good and can be bad at the same time. At least everyone's reading, or many more people are reading, not everyone. The International Copyright Law of 1891 gives protections to foreign authors in the US and also US authors who are abroad. Becoming a literary celebrity is now a possibility. Like a lot of the time before, your work wasn't really read or published until after your death. Of course, that's not true with every author, but that's really common. And now, because of the mobility of literature, you can be alive and writing and publishing, and people are reading your work in their homes and being excited about that. And you can be recognized, and you can think about like who are our current or recent literary celebrities. I think of people maybe like George R.R. Martin. Everybody knows the name George R.R. Martin in Game of Thrones. Let's see, when I was a little bit younger, Stephenie Meyer and her Twilight series was a big household name. Of course, J.K. Rowling. So there are these literary celebrities, and this is, becoming popular now in the time period that we're studying now. And that is just because publishing made literature a lot more visible. Magazines were getting cheaper, and there were magazines for various groups of people. Again, we have different classes of readers. So our book also talks about realism. And again, we talked a little bit about this kind of in the beginning of the lecture, but realism is trying to depict life for what it is. Literary fiction that was rooted in the observation and documentation of the details of everyday life. Some examples of that include regional writing. So authors are kind of recognizing that, oh, okay, there's this culture here in this region that I want to depict and show to people who maybe don't live in this region. Vernacular speech is part of realism. So spelling words the way that they sound when someone speaking a certain dialect speaks. So instead of spelling the word, the way that it is in the dictionary, spelling it the way that it would sound. So kind of maybe giving a couple extra vowels in a southern word to create that southern drawl that you wouldn't hear if you were just reading a standard spelling. As you learn about realism, as we read our texts, we're going to read a lot of examples of realism. I think that, the criticism of realism is valid and interesting, and yet something maybe to be taken with a grain of salt. There are plenty of much smarter people that would debate me on this, but, critics of realism say that realism abandons the moral purpose of art, that maybe it's too vulgar or too commonplace, and maybe that realism is just kind of these dull observations rather than any kind of dramatic storytelling. And so, we have authors, literary theorists like Harold Bloom, who would say that, a lot of literature that we're reading now is not art, is not worth reading, that, maybe there's the canon for a reason because we need to read that. And I think that, reading literature for art's purpose is important, but also the work of realism in giving someone the opportunity to understand and empathize what someone else's life might be like is really important. Some personal criticism of realism, especially during the time period, would just be that at first, you're probably not going to get the voice of all people. You're going to get the voice of the majority of people until the voice of all people can be sought out, encouraged to write, given the means to write. And so there's, I think, a lot of, opportunities, like lost opportunities at this time period to have a broad spectrum of realism. And I think that, even today, we're still trying to have a broad spectrum of realism, have a broad spectrum of identifying, what people's stories are and what their perspectives are, especially people who are not the majority and who are marginalized or in some ways oppressed. So realism is, I think, interesting, but it's certainly criticized. Another thing that authors of this time are thinking about is what our book calls the woman question. Will women be educated, and if so, how? Will women participate in the workforce, and if so, how? And what kind of social influence will women have? We're starting to see social clubs for women. Of course, these are still segregated. White women, wealthy white women in wealthy white women social clubs, black women in social clubs for black women. There's not an overlap. Women social clubs have the opportunity to, tackle topics like gender roles in a more liberal view, or there were also social clubs created for women to, discuss their views that might be more conservative and more traditional on things like class, religion, and race. This section of our book talks also about how women were claiming new forms of autonomy, like suffrage, the right to vote, and then, also things like divorce. Can women get divorced? Can they initiate divorce? If so, how? How is it legal? Things like that. we've got a couple more sections in the introduction. One of them is Unforeseen Forces. I think this one kind of tackles a lot of different concepts. One of the things that it talks about is the concept of industrialization, which leads to large corporations. And some of that force, with the heading force, part of that is that some people, and you'll see this come up in thematic ideas, I think in one of the weeks we're going to read about like companies having more power than the individual, and what that could mean for America if it's run by companies. And I think we're still asking this question and dealing with this question and wondering about it. We get, with Charles Darwin and Herbert Spencer, I think, we get science and ideas about evolution and natural selection and competition, but a lot of that, specifically like Darwinism, is used to justify a lot of racial violence and exclusionary acts, to say that, it's survival of the fittest, or this is natural selection, and so that's why I can oppress you because I am the stronger person, I am the higher being, or this is my natural order, or something like that. A lot of Darwinism and Darwin ideas are used to justify, all sorts of racial violence. And so while we're getting science that's helpful, like x-rays, we're also getting scientific theories that are really damaging. Something else in this section is another type of realism, naturalism. It's a little bit more of a bloodier, violent version of realism. So realism mostly refers to, like, if you wanted to make the distinction, realism mostly refers to maybe like the more cordial elements of life, home life, family life, work life, social things, but naturalist writers said you're missing the real gory parts of realism, of life. Like, life isn't just sunshine and rainbows and like small feuds or little conflicts, or like, what's Sally gonna wear to the ball or whatever. It's like gore and violence of life, especially for marginalized groups, the way that people have to experience things, that are vastly different from those who are in the majority. And some naturalist texts also sought to highlight masculine violence, because some of these authors decided that having like white collar jobs and professional careers now that this was possibility, that men were becoming soft. And so we'll read some examples of writing that shows men in a much more violent role, kind of more animalistic, back to, the man instinct or something like that. So naturalism covers a lot of that content as well. And then finally we get, just really briefly, like a little military history sort of, in the final section of the introduction, the new American empire. One of the brief statements the book makes is that war could be seen as a possible solution to men's softness. Maybe we don't just need violent texts, maybe we need war. Of course, we get that. Some feared that too much exercise of military power would increase the number of non-whites living under the American flag, so it's sort of a less noble fear. But also, some of our authors, like William Dean Howells and Mark Twain, had distrust in the intentions and rhetoric of patriotism and of military power. And so we will read Editha by William Dean Howells, that kind of highlights maybe the problematic side of just like pure-hearted patriotism. And of course, eventually we get to World War I, which confirms the United States' status as global powerhouse. And so we get to where people, like political figures, want us to be as a country. And that pretty much covers everything in the introduction. Definitely read it. There's tons of details in here that I didn't cover, but this is just sort of a quick nutshell for you. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Send me an email. Otherwise, I hope you guys are doing well, and I hope to talk to you soon.